Good afternoon and welcome to the Dairy Signal. We're glad you could join us today. Today's episode focuses on pasture inventory and smarter grazing timing. We are pleased to be joined by Michael Geisinger, Grazing and Nutrient Management Outreach Specialist with UW Extension. Before we get started with today's program, I do want to remind you that it is a live program, and if you would like to use this time to ask Michael questions, you can click the three dots in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to ask your questions. Also, for those that are looking for continuing education credits, there will be a quiz at the end of today's program. Please submit the quiz and you will be entered for your continuing education credits. Before we get started, I would also like to thank DLF for sponsoring today's episode of the Dairy Signal. Success starts with the seed, and that's why farmers trust DLF. The world's largest forage seed leader, backed by cutting-edge research, DLF delivers high-yielding forage products with the traits that producers need to drive profit on their farms. Be sure to ask your retailer about high-performance alfalfa brands like Forage First, 5 Series, Alpharex Seeds, and you can learn more at lacrosseseeds.com. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Haley. Appreciate that introduction and glad to be joining the Dairy Signal here today for the first time. As Haley mentioned, I'm going to be discussing some sort of spring grazing management considerations. So I've titled my talk here today, Springing into Spring Grazing, counting down from three. We're going to discuss some spring tune-ups for a successful grazing season. And if you aren't as familiar or work with grazing as much, I think that there's still going to be some relevant content in here, or maybe it would just be an opportunity to brush up on the topic a little bit more. So I'm glad to be here. I work with Extension on the grazing outreach side of things and kind of have a kind of a statewide position in my role and work. So I always like to start my presentations with some actionable takeaways for everyone. And so after today, you should be able to do a few different things. So first, you should be able to determine when soil and pasture conditions would be suitable to start spring grazing. Second, you should be capable of taking and utilizing a forage inventory of pastures to decide when to start spring grazing. And then lastly, you should be able to manage your pastures through the spring growth flush successfully. And so those are going to be our focuses today. Before we jump into that, though, I wanted to get started with some context on managed grazing. And so if you think about managed grazing, if you aren't as familiar with it, I think an easy way to think about it maybe would be to compare it to a more conventional like hay production scenario. And so if you think about a tale of two fields, we have an alfalfa field that's maybe more conventionally managed for hay production, and then we have a pasture field in this example. And on that alfalfa field, there's going to be a few different things that happen. Maybe before planting or while that alfalfa is growing, we're going to be doing things like applying manure, running tractors across the field to add fertility before seeding, and maybe after cuttings that we take. We're also going to be mechanically harvesting that forage and taking that forage off the field and usually storing it. You know, silos aren't as common anymore, obviously, but maybe a little bit easier to set up that graphic in a silo or a bunker silo or something along those lines. And then ultimately feeding it to our cows, usually in more of like a confinement type scenario. Maybe they have some access to pasture, or maybe not. Under a managed grazing scenario, we're kind of taking that same field and concept, but we're subdividing it into different areas that we would typically refer to as paddocks. And we're rotating those cows through those paddocks, allowing them a period to recover and regrow. And so instead of mechanically harvesting the forage, we're using our cows to do that for us. And then as we're moving our cows, they're leaving their manure deposits behind. And so we're also factoring out that need for like manure application as well. And then maybe supplementing these cows, you know, if they're lactating herd, probably with a TMR or something like that in the barn. If they're heifers, probably 100% grazing. If I had to sort of take the visual out of that and define it in words, this is probably how I do it. I'll say it really quickly for you, but the three things to focus on in this slide are managed grazing is focused on what we call the three R's, and so you'll pay attention to those bolded R's as I'm going through this. But managed grazing is a cost-saving pasture-based livestock management approach that relies on planned livestock rotation. So that's the first R, at least every 1 to 3 days on perennial pasture. Adequate forage residual, so that's the second R, and that refers to the forage left over after grazing. Rest periods for forages to fully recover, so that's the third and final R. And then stocking decisions that are aligned with carrying capacity of the land with the ultimate goals of optimizing animal livestock performance, supplying high quality forage, improving farm profitability, and reducing environmental impacts. And so that's just an overview to set up the context for managed grazing. But now that I've done that and talked about maybe all the wonderment of managed grazing, I have a question for everyone here. So what's the fastest way to shorten the grazing season? And I'm not expecting an actual response here, but I'll just pause for a moment to see if you maybe think of a few things. And as you're thinking about this question, a few things that might be coming to mind would be things like drought, which we faced on and off throughout the over the last 5 years here in Wisconsin. You could be thinking about things like soil fertility, or maybe trampling or difficulty maintaining that forage stand. Um, but really, probably the fastest way to shorten the grazing season on our cool season perennial pastures here in Wisconsin would actually be starting too early. And by starting too early, we can stress those forages out. And so delaying that start will help us maintain healthy, unstressed forages that can produce higher yields and continue growing longer in the fall than if you had turned out too early. And so spring turnout in a grazing scenario oftentimes requires waiting longer than we would maybe desire as we sort of look out at that spring pasture and that fresh growth that we want to start grazing. Um, and ultimately, that timing of spring turnout is going to be unique for each farm's soil, forages, and management. And just to emphasize a little bit further, the long-term benefits of waiting for the right time to start grazing uh, really need to be considered over the short-term benefits of just getting cows on grass as quickly as we might like in the spring. And it just takes a little bit of patience. And so I think patience is ultimately what managing pastures well in spring will come down to. And in order to practice that today and sort of create a mnemonic device for this presentation, and something you could remember afterward is we're going to take a breath and we're going to count down from three together and go through each of these three things. So from three, we're going to assess pasture condition. Two, we're going to take a forage inventory. And then one, we're going to manage the spring flush successfully. So starting with three, assessing pasture condition, we're ultimately asking that question on pasture, can I even be here yet? Is this area actually suitable for grazing or not? And so in order to assess that condition, there's a few questions that we're probably going to want to be asking. First, is soil moisture suitable for our expected traffic from grazing, or does it seem like it could get pugged up or compacted pretty easily? And then for newer seedings, is the forage established enough to withstand grazing, or does it kind of look like those newer plants could be uprooted from just grazing behavior? Another thing, just a quick note on new seedings, like if it was seeded in the fall or something like that, you might actually consider mechanically harvesting that first cut. There's some data to support that will lead to a stronger stand establishment and productivity over time. And so maybe you're not even looking at turning out in spring onto a new seeding. And then on farms with soil and terrain variability, you could sort of look at conditions on paddocks that are higher ground, coarser textured soils that stay drier. You could look at grazing those areas sooner than areas that tend to stay wet in spring. And here are just a couple of tips and tricks on how you could assess pasture condition. When you're assessing those newer seedings, you could do a hand pluck test. So just grabbing some of that forage and sort of yanking it to mimic the grazing habit of a cow, and then seeing, is that forage sort of tearing off nicely or is it uprooting at all? You can compare high and low areas of your farm by doing just a farm walk through the pastures. And you could also, just do something simple like pay attention to your boot heel as you're walking through your pastures. Or you could use a shovel to assess soil condition as well. And, how saturated are those soils? Are they suitable for grazing or not? And so that's the number three. And now we're going to move on to number two here. So number two will be taking a forage inventory. So is there enough forage to start grazing or not? One approach to taking a forage inventory could be what I refer to as guesstimating. So in spring, our pastures grow pretty rapidly, adding about 100 pounds of dry matter per acre per day. And our goal is to have about 10 to 20 days of grazing forage available when we start grazing in the spring. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a few slides, but that typically will correspond to about 3 to 4 developed leaves per tiller in a moderately dense sward of forage. We also want to wait to start grazing until forage height is twice the target residual height. And so a common residual height we would recommend in Wisconsin is about 4 inches. Leaving that height behind after grazing will allow those forages to recover from photosynthetic reserves instead of root reserves. And so if we're targeting a 4 inch residual as a sort of minimum, we might want to graze around 8 inches minimum. And the purpose of this slide is just to provide some basic rules of thumbs if you're going to guesstimate forage inventory. But it's also possible to estimate forage inventory, and we can do that by using a grazing stick. And so I don't know how well it'll show up on Zoom here today, but I have a grazing stick here in my office with me, and so this is what I'm referring to, and you can see it the picture of it here on the left-hand side of the slide. These are available from the Grassworks organization in Wisconsin. You can scan that QR code to go to their website and order one. I think they're about $14 if I'm remembering correctly. We also have a guide to using this within UW-Madison Extension, so you can check that guide if you're looking for further guidance. I'm going to give you an overview of generally how this tool could be used in pastures today, but if you want to go further in depth, that guide would probably be the place to consult. A grazing stick is helpful because it accounts for forage density and forage type, which can ultimately provide a better estimate of forage inventory than visual assessment to know how much forage you have first, and then second, know how many days of grazing you have available. And so the part one of that would be how much forage is available. So how are we going to use this stick in pastures to assess that? Well, first we're going to go around and take some height measurements of our forages in the pasture from several locations, and then we're going to figure out what the average height is. And so if you're walking through your pastures and let's say they're closer to 10 inches high on average, so I have that grass up there showing that, we calculate our average height of 10 inches. Next, we're going to actually take this stick and we're going to slide it horizontally near the soil surface underneath the forage. And there's a side of it here that we'll want to have face up with all these dots and this grid on it. And then we're going to look down at the grazing stick from above to see how many dots are showing once we do that. And so let's say we slide that into the forage stand, and then we have this much grass covering up that grazing stick, and we have 2 dots left showing. And so that indicates on this other table, which is also on the stick, that there's about a medium density of forage here. And for our sake today, let's just say we're working in an orchard grass and clover pasture. We can use that information then to figure out about how many pounds of dry matter per inch per acre are in that pasture. And so if we go to our orchard grass and clover forage type, and then we go to that medium density category, we see that there's about 250 to 300 pounds of dry matter per inch per acre. So for every inch of that forage height, it's about 250 to 300 pounds of dry matter. So now that we have that information, we can calculate how much forage is available. So in order to get grazable forage, we're going to consider the total forage height, the average height of 10 inches, But we're also going to consider the residual height that we want to leave behind. And so that's forage that wouldn't be available for grazing that we're kind of setting aside for forage regrowth and recovery, being able to utilize that pasture throughout the rest of the year. And we're going to get a grazable height then of 6 inches. And then using that number that we calculated before, the 250 pounds dry matter per inch per acre times 6 inches, we'll calculate that there's about 1,500 pounds of dry matter per acre of forage available for grazing. And then we want to take this one step further in planning for spring turnout and calculate how many days of grazing are available. In order to do that, we have to calculate the intake of cows. So we usually use 4% of body weight as a sort of standard for grazing to calculate forage intake. This would typically be closer to 3%, and you all probably work with nutritionists quite a bit more than I do. But the reason we use 4% in a grazing scenario is to help buffer for things like trampling, selective grazing, maybe uneven grazing, changing conditions. It just provides a nice little buffer to support that continued forage growth. And so it's a little bit more conservative of an estimate than anything. So for example, let's say we have one 750-pound heifer and we take 4% of her body weight. Her dry matter intake per day would be about 30 pounds per day. So if we want to run through a quick example on these numbers, let's say we have 50 dairy heifers on 40 acres and 100% of that ration is from grazing. So we're going to take pounds of dry matter per acre available times total pasture acres for total pounds of dry matter available. So with our numbers here, we'll do 1,500 pounds of grazing forage available times our 40 acres. We get 60,000 pounds of dry matter available. And then next, we're going to take pounds of dry matter intake per day times total head. So that 30 pounds of dry matter intake per day for one heifer times 50 heifers would mean that we have 1,500 pounds of dry matter per day needed by this herd of 50 heifers. Next, we're going to divide our total dry matter available divided by 1,500 pounds dry matter intake per day to calculate how many days of grazing are available. So in this example, we've calculated 40 days of grazing would be available, which would be more than enough for spring. You'll remember that we typically would recommend 10 to 20 days, probably closer to 20 days of grazable forage to be available before starting spring grazing. So the nuance here is this is kind of showing you how to do the math a little bit, but ultimately you have to calculate this for your unique forage, herd size, and acreage. Another use case for this math that honestly might be a little bit more useful is calculating the average forage height needed to start grazing in the first place. So instead of going out and measuring forage as it's grazing, figuring out how much you have, let's just calculate how high the forage should be before we start grazing in the first place, and then just monitor for that average forage height to be reached. So for our 50 head heifer herd, we calculated 1,500 pounds of dry matter per day was needed for their intake. So for 20 days of grazing, that would be 30,000 pounds of dry matter. And on a per acre basis, we're going to divide that by the 40 acres of pasture we have. So we'll calculate that we need 750 pounds of dry matter per acre needed in order to start grazing. Based on that 250 pound dry matter per acre for medium density orchard grass and clover, we'll divide that 750 pound number by that, and we'll calculate that we need 3 inches of grazable forage to start grazing. But we're not done yet. Remember, we have to add that 4 inches of residual on top of that, that planned residual that we're going to leave behind to support continued forage growth and productivity and quality over the season. So once we add that amount in, we get an average height of 7 inches is needed on this 40-acre pasture to confidently start grazing this 50 head heifer herd. And you've heard me mention a few times already, but I'll just reiterate and double down here that average height is a pretty critical term for taking a forage inventory. There's going to be grass that's taller, and there's going to be grass that's shorter than that average height. The tallest height measured should never be used to do these calculations because you'll almost certainly will start spring grazing too early, which could have some negative ramifications and shorten your grazing season, like I mentioned earlier. And so you want to ensure that you're taking numerous measurements and actually getting an average height. When you're sticking that grazing stick into the forage stand, don't kind of hold up the tallest blade of grass and see how high it is. Just kind of pay attention to where the forage is and where the densest part is covering on that grazing stick. So in spring, we want to monitor this forage inventory pretty readily and introduce spring forage to cows slowly. So just a couple notes on sort of that adjustment period for pastures and uh, working with nutritionists on this type of stuff would probably work better too. But a general rule of thumb that I consider is we think about a 2 week rumen adjustment period. Uh, Livestock that are a little bit bigger, maybe above 500 pounds, could probably get by with just supplementing some roughage like dry hay during that period. Less than 500 pounds, you might want to look at supplementing a little bit closer to what their winter ration could have been, and wean them onto pasture a little bit more gradually, a little bit more gently. Uh, Risking bloat and poor utilization of forage in spring also risks missing out on the highest quality forage of the year in our pastures. And so this is a pretty critical part of like as we're introducing cows to pasture, and that's why I wanted to include it here today. If the forage growth is ever slowing during spring, maybe there's like a really cool period, it's just not growing as fast, we can slow that rotation down, that I kind of demonstrated in that graphic slide I showed at the beginning. We can slow that rotation down to help ensure that optimal forage utilization and pasture recovery is maintained. And so that's one option for managing that way. Um, but what about when grass outruns the cows? And this is our last thing. So we've gone down three, two, one, and then one is what happens when grass outruns the cows. And it's just also something we commonly refer to as the spring flush, that period of quick growing forages in the spring. And so in Wisconsin, our cool season pastures tend to grow faster than cows graze it during spring. And grazing management can be adjusted to address this and maximize forage quality in a few ways. And that's why I say the spring surplus is a management, not a growth problem. It's not that the pastures are growing too fast, right? That's a good thing. It's producing the quality forages that we want. It's ultimately how we're going to manage those fast growing pastures differently than we would manage them later in the year when they're not growing quite as fast. And there's a few different ways we can do that I'll run through here to wrap up our talk today. So the first is we can adjust our rotation schedules. The second is we could strategically harvest hay or clip pasture. Third, we can manage seed heads to boost our pastures. And then lastly, we can do what I call or refer to as spring flash grazing. And I'll run through each of these and kind of discuss each one a little bit more in detail here in a second, what I mean by them. So the first option for managing the spring flush is adjusting rotation schedules. So if you look at this graphic here on the left, where maybe we start grazing in paddock number one, and we move to two, and then to three, and then to four, and we're aiming to leave at least 4 inches of residual behind after each grazing to support efficient forage regrowth. And we're going to want to rotate our livestock at least every 2 to 3 days. Um, Sometimes though, if let's say we get to the fourth paddock and we're pretty much done grazing that down to that 4 inch height, sometimes that first paddock, that paddock number one you've grazed is ready for grazing again. So maybe your target height is like 8 inches and it's 8 inches tall and ready for grazing again. And so what are you going to do then? And pretty much why this happens in spring is typically in spring our pastures will recover a lot quicker than other times of year. Our cool season pastures in Wisconsin will usually take 14 to 21 days to rest and recover in spring compared to 30 days or even more during other times of year. And so one option if you run into that would be to return to paddock one if it's ready to be grazed even if paddocks 5 through 8 have not been grazed yet. Uh, and this allows us to do a few different things. And this is where these other strategies kind of start to play into here a little bit. And so if we've grazed 1 through 4 and then we're returning to 1 because it's ready to be grazed again, that leaves paddocks 5 through 8 that have not been grazed yet during that initial spring grazing rotation. And so the first thing that we could do there is we could strategically harvest hay on those pastures with the ultimate goal of increasing our stored feed reserves. We could use that stored feed to supplement hay during drought or conditions that aren't allowing grazing later in the season, like a summer slump. It could even supplement maybe winter feed for heifers or something like that. The reason that we want to do something though with those paddocks 5 through 8 is that most of our spring growth here in Wisconsin is reproductive. And because it's reproductive, it produces a seed head, and over maturing is just going to be a greater consideration to prevent that lower quality, stemmy sort of growth that we see when seed heads are developed than later in the season. And once it's been grazed or harvested once, it'll turn toward that more vegetative, leafier, higher quality growth. And not that stemmy behavior. And so it's ultimately about getting that sort of reproductive cycle uh, uh, in check early in the season. So ultimately, too, vegetative growth ultimately will drive high intake and utilization by our cows, and so that is our primary goal. Another option you would have for those 5 through 8 paddocks would be to strategically clip them. A goal of this could be nutrient recycling. It also preserves that forage for grazing later. So instead of harvesting the forage for hay and storing it for later, it preserves more of that forage. Usually, if you're clipping it at a height of about 6 to 8 inches, for example, it preserves more of that forage for grazing later, if you don't want to run into any shortages later. So you could clip it pretty simply. There's a few different options, whatever works for your farm. Something like a brush mower or a hay bine or a sickle mower, could do that. And really the goal is just to get those seed heads clipped off. We're not trying to clip off a lot of the residue or anything like that. And so that's our primary goal with this. It could recycle some of those nutrients from seed heads back into the soil, and then turn that forage back to vegetative growth. Another option we have for managing those 5 through 8 paddocks we see here on the bottom, photo here of some seed heads popping up. So we could split that into a few different management scenarios. So if we want to manage seed heads for like pasture seeding or increasing our forage stand on certain acres, we could look at doing like a high density grazing where there's lots of trampling and maybe a little bit longer residence period in that area on a quarter of the acres to integrate those seed heads. So allowing those seed heads to start seeding out and then grazing them to effectively kind of plant them or work them into the pastures. We could clip a quarter of the acres to remove seed heads and preserve that forage for grazing later. And then we could harvest the remaining half of the acres for hay to keep the forages vegetative and increase our stored feed reserves. And the reason that I propose this is like a separate management scenario is that this is kind of demonstrating there's lots of flexibility in the ways that we manage those areas that don't get grazed in the spring, if we return to that paddock that's available for grazing. And so there's lots of different options, and I think it takes some trial and error for each farm to figure out, what works best. And maybe in any given year, you might have a different sort of management philosophy on it or a different management goal to achieve. And so, this kind of is demonstrating that you have some flexibility in managing that, right? And then lastly, the other one that I mentioned that's a little bit different approach that used to be, my understanding, a little more popular, maybe is less talked about now, would be spring flash grazing. And what I mean by flash grazing is all of these paddocks are divided a little bit differently. Usually you're combining the area of two paddocks into one. And then our goal here is to just do an initial quick grazing of all of the paddocks. When the forages are about 8 inches high, you could still use your grazing stick to calculate, that you have 10 to 20 days available of grazable forage. So While you're doing this, though, you'll want to do frequent, probably daily moves across areas about twice the size of what paddocks would be later in the season. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, you're expanding those paddocks areas and you're moving them maybe a little bit quicker than you otherwise would be. Um, just to do a quick initial grazing of everything and set those forages back to vegetative growth out of reproductive growth. This also sets up the grazing wedge for the year. It keeps pastures vegetative, forage available for grazing, and it can help stagger pasture growth for the season a little bit better, maybe than some of the other management approaches that I talked about. I think that this also fits especially well on, if a dairy farm is lactating cows, or maybe you're considering going organic and you need to graze those lactating cows a little bit. This approach sort of maintains the forage that's going to be available for those cows and their higher intake needs, but will also probably maintain the higher quality that you would want for your lactating cows as well. And so I kind of really like this approach as a management consideration, but I also want to be cautious here. Maybe it doesn't get talked about as much for this reason, but the spring flash grazing approach requires careful monitoring and management, and it's really easy to overgraze under this approach accidentally. So if those cows are left in a paddock maybe longer than you were planning on, it would be pretty easy to overgraze, especially this approach would allow you to start closer to maybe that 10 days of grazing available than the 20 days in order to get over all the acreage that you would want. If you do end up overgrazing, like I mentioned earlier, you can create a substantial summer slump and an earlier than normal decline in productivity later in the season. And it's not that you can't overgraze under the other scenarios either. It's just that this particular management scenario it sort of opens up the possibility of grazing a little bit earlier than the other ones maybe. But with that also comes a greater risk of overgrazing. And so that's something to consider, and it's something that would just have to be monitored pretty closely if you were going to implement this approach. So to review, we kind of ran through all of this pretty quickly today, but managing our pastures well in spring usually comes down to patience. And so when preparing for spring grazing and managing it, we're going to remember my mnemonic device here today, right? Remember to breathe, and then we're going to count down from three with our three strategies. We're going to first assess that pasture condition and figure out if the soil and forages are suitable for grazing or not. And if the soil and forages are suitable, then we're going to move forward and take a forage inventory, figure out how much forage is there, how many days of grazing are available, or we could even back calculate what is our target forage height to start grazing this year based on our current head and what percent of their ration is coming from grazing. And then lastly, we're going to manage the spring flush successfully by sort of being adaptive in our management and implementing a few different management strategies for addressing areas that maybe went ungrazed during that first rotation. Or in the case of our spring flash grazing, we're going to quickly graze all of those paddocks and keep them in vegetative growth. So I want to just wrap up today with a couple of QR codes available, and that's our extension website for all of our grazing resources. You can go there to find more information on grazing. We're continually adding more information there, so it's a great place to get plugged in on grazing stuff, or maybe you haven't worked as much in grazing. That website can provide a good place to brush up on what we're referring to when we say manage grazing and how it's different than other types of pasture management. And then the second QR code here is where you can go to get a grazing stick from the Grassworks organization. And so, like I said, these are pretty inexpensive tools to use for taking a forage inventory, and was pretty well our focus today. I think if you're grazing cows at all, this is a pretty critical piece of equipment to have available. So I would definitely recommend people consider getting one of those. They sometimes get given away for free at like grazing events. I know there's a grazing school. I didn't put anything in the slides here on this. Um, Coming up in Lancaster in May that you could register for. I'm pretty sure they'll be giving those away there too. But and then lastly, here's my email, michael.geisinger@wisc.edu. I would love to get in touch with anyone that wants to talk more about grazing. I have a special interest in where grazing could fit into our Wisconsin dairy systems, whether that's organic transition, dairy heifers, or even grazing our lactating herd too. So if you're interested in talking more about that, I'd love to get in touch. Or if you just have just technical questions that you want to reach out about, feel free to get a hold of me there. Uh, is probably the best place. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation and turn things back to Haley to see if we had some questions or discussion to keep things going.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael, so much for sharing your insight today. I do have a couple questions for you. The first being you obviously shared those three tips to manage the spring flush. Which one do you think is the best approach?
Yeah, it's Uh, ultimately, the best approach is going to depend a little bit on each farm's goals, their unique soils, forages, cows, everything like that, right? So I don't know that there's like one size that fits all. Uh, I have maybe I don't know if I'd say it's the best approach, but I maybe have a special interest right now in that uh, spring flash grazing approach that I kind of mentioned toward the end there. And the reason I have a special interest in it is it's a way to maintain high quality forage by keeping things vegetative. Um, it's also preserving that forage for grazing, so you're not harvesting it. And if you have a big enough herd that you know you're going to be utilizing that during the grazing season, it's a great opportunity to preserve that. And the third thing that I really like about that in my sort of approach and work in grazing is that it eliminates the need for any equipment to be going out to that field. Really, we're leveraging the usefulness of our cows to kind of do that job of setting back the reproductive growth for us. And so that's maybe one reason I really like that approach. I know a few people have done it around the state, and it's maybe a little more common than I let on initially. But it's something that I haven't heard get talked about quite as much in programming recently. So that's why I wanted to address it today for sure.
Awesome. Another question I have for you. We talked a lot today about forage inventory and especially the use of the grazing stick. What other tools are available to farmers wanting to dive deeper into pasture management and monitoring? Specifically, I'm thinking other tools, and are there any apps or like software that's available that farmers could utilize?
Yeah, for sure. This is a developing space, right? And so I think first, just to understand the basics of taking a forage inventory, having that grazing stick is going to be like really helpful for understanding the principles, and it's relatively easy to pick up because it's more or less like you saw in the slides. Maybe it was a little overwhelming doing that math a little bit today, so I apologize on that. But it is really more or less the back of the envelope math that would be pretty easy for anyone to pick up and do. It kind of helps us learn the principles behind what taking a forage inventory means, and helps us. And we can set up a grazing wedge using that tool. It should be used to assess when we start grazing in spring, but it could also be used like during the season to assess, what are our pastures or paddocks that are really those A students that are doing really well? And then what are the ones that are lagging behind? And maybe that merits further investigation. So if we're taking that forage inventory over the year, it helps us set up something we would kind of refer to as a grazing wedge. So like which paddocks have more forage available, which ones have less forage available. And that can inform our management decisions and like where we're moving those cows around on that graphic I showed. And so I still think the grazing stick is like a great tool, and it is the lowest barrier to entry. It's just the nature of it. It's inexpensive, easy to pick up and learn. But there are some really cool tools coming out and that have been out to help us take forage inventories a little bit differently. So one is like an ultrasonic sensor, and that one would be called Paddock Track. And that's mounted on an ATV, and then it pretty much just measures forage height and density, and then goes into a model to calculate the forage inventory of each paddock that you measure. So one barrier there potentially is that you have to do those measurements and take that ATV out in your pasture, and so that's a hang up for some people. A hang up for any of these emerging technologies too is just learning the platforms that they're on. So that's one. Another one is called Pasture IO, and that one's really new. And that's more of a satellite imagery based approach. So it doesn't require going across those fields with an ATV or anything like that. Um, and so it's just a little bit, it's utilizing satellite imagery instead of that direct measurement, so to speak. And then I think in the future, in the next few years, I think we'll probably start seeing a few more technologies come out that are pretty promising to me right now in the literature. And uh, one of those would be like UAVs or drones that are mounted with LiDAR or RGB sensing loadout technologies, where you could do a flyover of the farm and get measurements that way that go into a model. That one would be pretty cool when it comes out. I think right now, though, as far as technology, that's pretty widely available, um, and probably provides the most accurate measurement. I would say Paddock Track is probably still probably edges out a little bit over a tool like Pasture IO. Um, I think that could change in the next few years. This is a space that's so new and keeps changing. But it's great to see that there's a lot of new technology coming out there that, people could implement. And again, if you're just learning how to do this for the first time, I think a grazing stick is the spot to start. But if you really wanted to dive deeper, I think there is stuff out there for people that want that.
Great. Another question I had, I think we touched on it a little bit before, but could you talk to me more about the grazing rotation speed as we get further into summer or early summer? What does that grazing speed look like compared to the spring flush?
Yeah, so it's ultimately going to be based on residual, right? So we're monitoring and we're adaptively grazing. So um, depending on how forages continue to grow and like what weather conditions are like, if forage is growing pretty fast and we want to stay ahead of the growth, you could keep moving it and leave more residual, or you could adapt it down. It more or less, we're typically looking at like a 1 to 3 day residence period. So I know in like a dairy cow scenario, those cows will probably get moved twice a day. For a lot of dairy heifer scenarios, it's pretty common that those would continue to get moved once a day throughout the year. Dairy heifers are maybe a little bit easier. You could, make it a little lower maintenance by increasing that residence time. The main thing you'll just want to pay attention to, though, as we go into summer and that forage growth slows down, is if they are being allowed to stay out there for 3 days, do they have access to a big enough paddock that they aren't going to graze it down less than that 4 inch residual height? Because if that happens, the forages will turn to their carbohydrate reserves in their root systems. And not to get overly technical, but it's a little bit more difficult for those forages to bounce back from that compared to if they have a 4 inch or higher residual left, then they'll stick to using those photosynthetic reserves to recover, which just bounces back a little bit quicker. So you'll ultimately probably have more grazable forage in managing for that residual. And then, as I mentioned before, too, under spring management, uh, it might be 2 weeks, 14 to 21 days before you come back to that initial paddock and it's ready to be grazed again. Later in the summer, it might be 30 or more days before you're coming back there. And so I think it's just really paying attention to the forages, the conditions, and that's again where the value of continuing to take that forage inventory and set up that grazing wedge can be helpful. And I think it's something too that like you'll probably get a sense for as you continue to get more experience grazing, or if there are people here that have done a lot of grazing, it's probably something that they're pretty confident in kind of assessing throughout the season. But if you're just getting started, I think it's pretty helpful.
Gotcha. We talked about the 4 inch residual. Is that common for all grass species, or is there a little bit of leeway there depending on the grass species that's being used?
Yeah, I would say it's a common goal for all of our cool season perennial pasture species in Wisconsin, and there's going to be species that can tolerate tighter grazing than that better than others. Um, but sometimes the species that tolerate that really close grazing aren't as productive as species that, if you just leave that 4 inch residual, will probably do better. And I've heard of people, successfully managing, down to like 3-inch residuals. I still think 4-inch is just a lot safer goal for managing that and maintaining that productivity. Um, so I think it's I would stick to the 4-inch number across the board, I guess. There are species that could tolerate closer grazing. Um, different livestock classes will influence this a little bit too, because the grazing habit of, small ruminants would be different than cows, for example. So 4-inch is kind of like most relevant for cows, I would think. But um, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you so far today. So thank you again, Michael, for joining us and sharing your insights on pasture inventory and grazing timing. I know I certainly learned a lot, so I appreciate that. And thank you to DLF for sponsoring today's episode of the Dairy Signal. And thank you again to everyone who tuned in today. We look forward to seeing you again on another episode of the Dairy Signal. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.